Hello there. Just before we get into today's content, I want to give a quick shout out to a new friend of mine, the Mimic Box. The Mimic Box are a 3D print company that you can find on Etsy. These guys, in fact, and they're really cool and they're really lovely. They are based in Portugal and they do 3D prints and they ship them out at a very reasonable cost. And if you go to their website right now, go to their website and you order anything, just type in the promo code JJPainting for 10% off, just to share the love of the hobby. It supports them, it supports me. I'd appreciate if you did it. You support your own hobby, and let's get into it. So, hello there, and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ, and welcome back to our second Ultramarines themed video in 2 weeks. I suppose I should call this something. Ultra Week, maybe? Maybe March from Mccrag, but that's going to be a thing for next year, I've already decided. But anyway, so if you're new here and wondering what we do on this channel, well, we take a model from the hobby, we take a subject from the hobby as well, sometimes whether it's the lore, a retrospect of the hobby itself, how things have changed, a review, sometimes a Battle Company challenge, but not recently, sorry about that. We paint the model, we talk about the topic, it's all very good and very fun, and obviously today we're talking about the Ultramarines, and we're doing this model here, the Victrix Guard, the other one. And the other thing about this is the first video we did was all about how the Ultramarines have been influential to us as hobbyists. This time it's all about the lore. So, without further ado, let's crack on. Okay, so if we're going to talk about the Ultramarines, then we need to talk about them in relation to their Primarch as well, and we can go from there really. So the thing about Gulemon is that amongst the Primarchs, he was quite unique in some respects, even amongst his brothers. First of all, you have to remember that, unlike all of them, Gulemon didn't just conquer his world. He also ruled it as a statesman and as a diplomat. He was a politician in many ways and knew how to be an administrator to a large organisation and a large empire in many ways. The thing to remember about Mccrag and Ultramar at large is that it was the largest single empire within the Gallic when the Imperium was spreading. There are other empires arguably that were of a similar size, but Mccrag and Ultramar were the only ones that came peacefully in many respects. And this was obviously to do with the fact that Gulemon's dad was running it, so it made good sense. But also this meant that Gulemon was a successful emperor in his own respect and in his own right. And that sets him apart from the other Primarchs, as I said, especially when you look at Primarchs such as Russ, the Khan, Mortarion, who all were conquerors for sure, but they weren't rulers, and they certainly weren't rulers on the same scale as Gulemon. And I suppose you're wondering at this point, how does that relate back to the lore and the influence of the Ultramarines? Well, as we all know, when it came to Gulemon, he was instrumental in Imperium Secundus in trying to effectively rebuild the empire centered on Mccrag, which, you know, is a bit of a controversial thing, and even he was not that proud of it in the end, but it was a good idea if you do look at it from a pragmatic point of view. This came down to working with his legions as well. A lot of people speculate that the reason the Ultramarines got so large is because he was just somehow better at being a general, or that there was an influx of troops from another legion, but that's a different video for a different time. But the truth is that he had one of the largest single empires to draw from. He had an enormous amount of resources, both in terms of people and materials, to put into his legion, hence why they grew so quickly. It's not just about being a good general, it's also being able to supply them. And when you then look at that in respects to a lot of the other legions who largely only drew from one, maybe two planets, the Ultramarines were drawing from up to 500 worlds at any one point. Obviously this gives them a much greater reach and a much greater scope of resources they can use. But anyway, if we get on to the Ultramarines, one of the other things about them, both from the heresy and from the point afterwards, and the Great Crusade obviously, is that because they were such a big legion, it did obviously mean that they were at the forefront of a lot of the conquests. But they weren't just destroying things, they were also builders in many respects as well, helping to shore up the Imperium's rule on the worlds they went to. They didn't just destroy the resistance in the same way that legions such as the Death Guard, the World Eaters, the Space Wolves, and even the White Scars were more prone to doing. And it is speculated that Gulemon was one of the Primarchs who was entrusted with going to human-dominated or human-led planets, whereas a lot of the other Primarchs were simply sent to where they knew the aliens were, or those places where they knew humanity would resist or refuse to submit. And that does say quite a lot. And there is some speculation that a lot of those worlds did stay loyal during the split, but that's speculation, that's not necessarily what we know for a fact. But what we do know for a fact is that obviously after the heresy, Gulemon's legion was still largely intact. Obviously this is partly to do with the fact that he only really had to deal with 2 of the legions during the heresy and not the full force of the War Master's fury. And a lot of people look down on legions such as the Salamanders, Iron Hands and Ravens, as a side note, for being so utterly trashed. But you have to remember they were caught in a very big ambush, and a surprisingly large number of the loyal legions really were decimated during the heresy when you get to the end of it. The Imperial Fists, Blood Angels and White Red Scars were lucky to have any survivors at all on Terra, all things considered. The Space Wolves were ripped to pieces 3 times over, first by the Thousand Sons, then by the Alpha Legion, and then again when they went after Horus, again, spoiler alert. But when you then put all that into context, is that the Ultramarines did have the largest number of surviving legionaries in the grand scheme of things, but what they also had is a structure. They had a much firmer understanding as to what their role would be. After the heresy, you have to remember that the perspective and the focus of what being a Space Marine was shifted again. They went from being crusaders and warriors to having to be defenders and being guardians of the Imperium at large, not simply being the conquering heroes of legend. They then had to protect the domains that they had built with the help of the Emperor. And when we then put this into context alongside a lot of the other things that happened at a similar time, such as the Codex Astartes obviously being massively influential on the Space Marines and being the thing that shaped all the chapters after the legions were broken down, but you have to remember that not all the chapters took it, and we'll get to that in a second. So those are a few things as to why the Ultramarines were influential in the galaxy, and obviously this leads me on to the last point to back this up, is that Gulemon himself obviously was in charge, both before his first wounding and again after his return. He was placed in command of the Imperium, and for a period the highest office on the High Lords of Terra was called Lord Gulemon after him. He was the only Primarch who was really able to administer and help rebuild the Imperium as a governor, as an administrator, after the Emperor was wounded and after Malcador died. And as a side note as well, one of the important things to remember about the Horus Heresy is it did leave the upper echelons of humanity's government utterly devastated. The most powerful figureheads were either destroyed or incapacitated, and it was largely due to Gulemon that humans, baseline humans, started ruling the Imperium. And whether or not you think that's a good thing or not, that was partly down to him. But those are things to say as to why the Ultramarines, and especially Gulemon, were influential on the Imperium. But here's a few reasons why maybe they aren't that influential. The first thing you need to remember is that even though a lot of the second founding chapters initially came from the Ultramarines, as time went by, more and more of them from other legions began to catch up and their numbers increased as well. But also, whilst they were very influential on Space Marines, the day-to-day runnings of the Imperium, the Ultramarines still were very much a light presence at the grand scheme of things. The first thing you have to remember is that there are planets in the Imperium by the 41st millennium that think the Space Marines are a myth or a thing of legends, and in some cases they genuinely believe they are completely extinct. The majority of the defense forces of most planets are made up of baseline humans in the forms of their planetary defense forces, the Astra Militarum, and their esoteric allies in the Adeptus Mechanicus in their armies. Those are in many respects the main 3 lines of defenses on a planet's defense, along with things like the Imperial Navy. The Space Marines themselves are only ever sent to where there is the most desperate fighting or the most important campaigns. They aren't simply stationed everywhere, and as a result, the Ultramarines' influence on the planets where they do hold domain is obviously quite high. But across the Imperium at large, they are a bit of a non-presence. And the other thing you have to remember about the Ultramarines is that they were shaped very much by their Primarch, the same way the Imperium was shaped. So they themselves are known for being effective governors, good leaders, and incredibly skillful generals in many respects. But again, this is leadership positions. This isn't day-to-day Imperium. They've not shaped the Imperium the same way that a lot of the other parts of the Imperium have. And the rise of the Ministerium, the cult of the Imperium, and the Emperor's Creed have all become far more prevalent in the Imperium society. Because you have to remember is that whilst the Ultramarines themselves never saw the Emperor as a godlike figure, the fact that there is a cult of worship around the Emperor now is something which is incredibly unfortunate for the Imperium and very much goes against the initial edicts of what the Emperor himself wanted. But also at the same time, the Ultramarines weren't completely immune to such things. After all, you have to remember they effectively built a temple around Robert Gulemon for a very, very long time. And that's something which he himself was a bit disappointed in, that the Ultramarines themselves were shaped by the moving trends in the Imperium rather than being able to remain completely true to what their origins were. But the other thing to remember about maybe why the Ultramarines weren't the most influential group in the Imperium is that whilst Mccrag and Ultramar at large was very much shaped by the ideas of Gulemon, things such as fairness, treating people well, giving everyone what they actually need to survive, whilst the Imperium is very much a Victorian work until you can't work work anymore model, that never really spread beyond Mccrag or beyond Ultramar at large. There was no sense that improving the lives of the average citizen of the Imperium was something which should be prioritized by local governors or planetary commanders or by anyone else for that matter. That was very much an Ultramarine system. And like I said in my Space Wars video, one of the reasons why Mccrag itself stayed so similar isn't just because that's a good way for the planet to function, but also for the surviving Marines of the Ultramarines. It was something of a memorial to a Primarch they'd lost. By keeping his legacy alive and keeping his empire alive in many respects, that gives them a connection to their Primarch that they otherwise wouldn't have had. But at the same time, the fact that this, unlike the Space Wolves one, probably would have been good for the Imperium, it's interesting that it wasn't able to spread and become a predominant way of doing things in the Imperium. It wasn't able to be used as a guiding light or a torch to make the lives of the people in the Imperium better. And it wasn't until Gulemon came back that such things started to take place. It's said a few times in things like the Dark Imperium books and the Uriel Ventress novels about how different the life of the average citizen on Mccrag or in Ultramar is compared to how it is across the rest of the Imperium. And the last thing to say on this is that Gulemon wasn't the only Primarch, obviously. He may be the only loyal Primarch currently in the show, in the picture, in an active way, but he wasn't the only one. There were others. Vulcan, Khan, Russ, were all influential in the Imperium, some for the better, Mortarion, Angron, Lorgar, and Horus for the worse, arguably. But ultimately it comes down to talking about the Ultramarines as a legion. To the Space Marines, they were incredibly influential. They had a massive legacy, and many of the Space Marines themselves are directly descended from them. The teachings of Gulemon are influential to the Space Marines, and to Mccrag and the planets touched by Gulemon himself, and the upper echelons of the High Lords of Terror all have an enormous amount to take from Gulemon and have a lot to thank him for. But for the rest of the Imperium, it's a light presence. He was, after all, only one of 20 or 18, depending on how you count. He was only one of a group of Primarchs. He was a Primarch who was very important, granted, but he was only one of their number, and in the histories of the Imperium, there are other people who have done almost as much as Gulemon, not in the same scale, maybe, but over time, and considering the Imperium's 10,000-year history, they do have a lot to thank Gulemon for. But they don't just have Gulemon to thank for that. There are others out there. And whilst Gulemon is influential, he's not the only name that matters in the annals of the Imperium. And the Ultramarines aren't the only legion that matter to the Imperium at large, either for its history or for its contemporary defense. Things have changed slightly now that Gulemon is back in charge of the show. So it could be said that he is hugely influential because he is in charge. But without him being in charge now, how much of an influence would he really have had? I don't know. Let me know your thoughts below. I look forward to hearing from you. So, there you have it. Those are my thoughts all about how the Ultramarines have been influential in the universe, in the Grimdark, and if they have or haven't been particularly influential, let me know your thoughts below as well. But thank you all very much for watching. I really do appreciate you spending the time here. So let me know your thoughts below. And whilst you're down there, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. I post my videos on Fridays and a day in the week. Thank you all very, very much for watching. Goodbye, and have a lovely day.